that, I'm going to give just a little bit of an introduction for Jon, and I'll let him kind of talk about himself a little bit as well. So your full title is a mouthful, so I'm going to read it off. So he is the Associate Professor in Agriculture and Engineering Technologies at the Ohio State Agriculture Technical Institute in Worcester, Ohio. Like I said, he's been doing a lot of research here. Water management is his main focus. And Jon, how many years now have you been working specifically on the conservation style ditches?
Probably going on 20 now,
20.
Starting as a grad student, progressing to where I'm at now. So a long time, mainly focused on the engineering design and then transitioning more into the water quality aspects of them.
Great. So again, at the Conservation District here in Erie, we've been thrilled with these projects, and we're hoping that more will consider these for their watershed management. And we hope to hopefully do some more in Erie County as well. So Jon, I'll let you take over.
Great. Thank you, Bree. I appreciate it. And I appreciate everyone joining today. It's nice to see so many people that are willing to hear a talk about what a lot of people might think is fairly boring and agricultural drainage ditches. But anyways, we've been doing quite a lot of research through a number of grant programs recently. Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, the Harmful Algal Bloom Research Initiative. So it's nice to kind of share with folks what we're finding. So everybody kind of knows what some of the water quality benefits might be, if folks want to implement these as well. So hopefully, tell me what you see on your screen here. Do you see the presentation mode? So thought I hit the share.
You did.
Maybe I didn't. Oh, I did.
We are working on getting the presentation up. Sorry for
There we go.
the little technical difficulties.
I didn't do that. I didn't do that part.
One more step.
How's that?
Okay.
Okay.
If somebody can just comment in the chat that you guys can see what
You
I'm
can see
seeing.
it.
Okay.
You're saying, they're saying.
Okay.
And it looks like there might be some folks in the lobby still. So for anybody that might not be familiar, those of you doing drainage work are probably really familiar with the traditional trapezoidal ditch design. We're calling anything alternative to that, maybe under this conservation channel design, umbrella term. You've probably heard two-stage, self-forming, over-wide, but we're trying to come more in line with the conservation drainage terminology. We're kind of referring to them as conservation channel design now. So, typical business as usual is on our upper left corner here, your traditional trapezoidal ditch, really focused on drainage, minimizing the amount of space taken out of production. A lot of them, many of these work very well, and we're not here to propose that every ditch in the state ought to be a two-stage ditch or a self-forming ditch. There's a lot of trapezoidal ditches that work perfectly fine. They aren't causing a whole lot of environmental, sort of problems. But where we do have problems, unstable banks, maybe frequent maintenance intervals, or we do want to do some, water quality type of work, maybe one of these other alternatives is an option. There is some research out there that shows dipping out of traditional trapezoidal ditches can actually be fairly beneficial for some aspects of water quality. Getting that sediment, legacy phosphorus out of the system. USDA has done some of that work in the Maumee watershed, really some compelling stuff. But today we're going to focus on these other practices. Originally, when we started doing these two-stage ditches, we'd find where maybe a county engineer or a soil and water district had constructed a ditch, and these little benches formed. It almost looked like a river with a stream within the ditch had formed, a little meandering channel. And some of our original research, 15, 20 years ago showed that these were very stable. They didn't build up. Those little floodplains kind of stabilized the banks. But if somebody was having, a capacity issue, oftentimes what they do is go in and dip out these little floodplain, these little floodplain benches that formed in the bottom and then restart that process, and they would rebuild. So as an alternative to that, to maybe reduce the maintenance frequency, if you needed additional capacity, you'd do what's on the bottom left here, and you'd just widen out at that little floodplain bench level, and that would give the extra capacity. And the best projects didn't take much land out of production, those sorts of things. And then we started dabbling in another, ideas like, well, what if we just made it over wide and we captured more and more sediments? Could that allow nature to kind of repair itself, and we'd store and trap more nutrients in sediment that would otherwise go downstream? So these are the sort of practices we're looking at, making slightly wider ditches with more capacity. And, as we get some climate change and changes in intensity of storms and things like that, there might be a lot of places where that would, could be really beneficial as well. Like I said, I don't think we need to go, I don't think we can afford to go out and change every ditch mile into one of these approaches. So just like any conservationist, there's the right tool to solve the right problem. We don't go putting waterways at the top of ridges. They don't solve a problem there. We put it where we're getting gully erosion. Similarly, where we can help solve landowner problems or water quality issues, that's where we want to put these approaches, because they do come at an additional cost up front. So we just hope some of those costs will the benefits will outweigh the costs. The folks at the Nature Conservancy went ahead and put together in the Maumee River a map of where some of the two-stage ditches are. I think, what do they got, 32 or something they were able to put in that watershed. We worked a lot with Indiana early on in this work. They've probably got several hundred of these because their system gives the county surveyor a lot of power to decide how they want to maintain their ditches. So we kind of have a whole process here, and things get kind of stuck in that process at time where they just said, hey, we're going to do a lot of these projects. And they had a lot of state funding, grant funding to help put these sort of things in. So they build these in other countries, many other countries around the world. So quite a few have been built, and, is there a place for them here in, Lake Erie watershed in Ohio, larger? I'm also going to talk about the overwide or self-forming channel concept, where we make the big flat bottom ditch and nature creates a two-stage system over time. There have been about 26 projects that have been done. And some of the data I'm going to show you today is the stars that are darkened in. That's from those sites. And most of those were done for development projects. So where a developer wanted to go in, they wanted to move or modify a stream. ODNR got to comment on those. Dan Mecklenburg, who works with me now at Ohio State, used to work for ODNR, and he commented. Sometimes they were able to get these overwide projects put in, and he's created an amazing database, some spanning 15, 16, 17 years of monitoring on these sites. So we can figure out what's been trapped in these sites, how's the geomorphology changed. And more recently, we've been going out and taking soil samples, sediment samples, and having those analyzed to see what sort of nutrients are trapped in there as well that didn't make their way down to the Gulf of Mexico or to Lake Erie, those sorts of things. If anybody really wants to see some of these projects, he's kind of done some historical photo documentation at a Flickr site down there. I think if you go in and you put self-forming streams, you'll eventually make your way to this site. But it's great. A lot of it's from before construction, at construction, and then years following. So that's a nice resource we have if anybody wants to go check that out. I just want to give you one example of one of those 26 sites. This site is actually in Marion, Ohio. It's downstream. It's in a watershed that's got a construction landfill. It's got a construction site yard there where a contractor has all their equipment and things. And then there is a steel mill there too. And this project that you're looking at was actually in a public park, Sawyer Ludwood Park. And they found that, downstream of the steel mill, there was all sorts of heavy metal contamination. So they got, I think it was a CERCLA project or something. And then they said, we're going to have to get all this soil out of here, and we're going to have to put it in an appropriate landfill. And then the original plan, I think, was to create, have a stream restoration project. And, through some talking, they were able to say, well, what if we just create a big blank space? Let's get all that soil out of there, and we'll let we'll let nature go to work and see what nature can do. If you think about this whole area, was glaciated at one point in time, and when the glaciers receded, we had a nice flattened landscape, and we didn't have a bunch of Native Americans there with excavators ready to rebuild our streams. Nature actually did a really nice job of that on its own. And so this is what it looked like right after construction. You get a few storms in and sediment comes in, and lo and behold, a stream channel starts to form. You get floodplains forming. They become vegetated. It's a real positive feedback loop, promotes sedimentation. Where the areas are low and wet, you get wetland coming in. Where they're higher and a little bit drier, you get the grasses coming in. And nature's just sort of sorting itself out. This particular site had a little bit of a head cut, so it down cut just a little bit. So we lost some of our storage capacity, but there's still a lot there. And it started creating riffles and pools, and it's just kind of a nice system. I know EPA followed that for many years, looking at the biology that was there. But you can kind of see that we didn't have to go engineer and build the endpoint. If we just gave nature a blank canvas, it would make its own little stream system. And part of what we've done is we've done it with these development projects in major wider areas, but this same sort of approach can work in an agricultural drainage ditch. So here's an example in the upper left. This is a development site, a school up in Northwest Ohio, where they're going to build the school. The drainage ditch was not going to have enough capacity. There was a drainage ditch before construction, and they simply just widened it out. They made a slightly wider trapezoidal ditch than they normally would. And I don't know if you can see here in the middle, a few years in, you can actually see that little meandering two-stage system forming. Real low floodplains, but that concept, nature likes to build that compound channel form as long as you have enough water and drainage area and then enough slope. If you don't have enough drainage area, enough slope, it's going to turn more into a wetland type of system. And you'll see that example with one of the sites up here in the Old Woman Creek. So just lots of vegetation, lots of good growth, lots of sediment deposition forming that two-stage system. Here's an example of one of the sites up here in the Old Woman Creek. On the upper left, you can see in the foreground, there was the ditch that existed before the project happened. And then you can see in the background, there's the excavator. They simply widened it a few feet on each side. So if you look at the aerial image on the right, they basically fit that slightly wider ditch within the existing buffer strip. There can be some complications if those buffer strips are in government programs, CREP and things. They don't like to see those buffers out. So that can be a challenge at times. But I think our best projects are going to be smaller headwater streams where we're not taking huge tracts of land out of production, those sort of things, making things slightly wider. And you can see this particular site became more of a wetland. It was really low sloping. And in the bottom right, we've gone out and we've sampled these soils, these sediments over the past couple of years. And when I show those soils to the wetland people, they get really excited about the mud that they see there and the good things that could be going on from a water quality perspective in those soils that are accumulating down at the bottom. So my background, I'm an ag engineer. I deal with like stream restoration, channel design sorts of things. So one of the things we study is called fluvial geomorphology. We want to understand how flowing water changes the world. So we go out and we take lots of surveys. We'll go out and monument, we'll put rebar in at cross sections, and we'll go back annually or every couple of years, and we'll take cross sections so we understand how the longitudinal profile of the ditch changes. Is it building up? Is it down cutting? How is our cross section changing? So here's an example. Here's two different sites that we had. And you can see anywhere the dash line, the green dash line is what we originally constructed. And you can see the black line is, as of our last survey, that was the shape of the stream. So basically in between the green dash line and the black dash line, that's how much sediment is accumulated on that site over that period of time. The red dash line is what we actually expect it to build to at someday. So you can see there's still a lot of an opportunity for a sink for sediments, for nutrients in these systems. And many of them we project can take a decade, maybe 5 or 6 decades to fill up and reach that end form. So we really look where there's erosion deposition and we figure out how much sediment's been trapped in place. Oops. Did have a couple animations that I didn't use to my advantage. Anyway, so of these 9 sites that we've been following for anywhere from 13 to 16 years or so, you can see there's a range of characteristics. Since they were development projects, most of them were fairly short reaches. So a couple hundred meters, a few hundred feet, up to 1,500 feet is maybe the longest one. So we're not talking about huge long reaches. They're draining, multiply the hectares by 2.5 or so. So you're looking anywhere from a fraction of a square mile up to maybe a couple square miles. So if, less than 100 acres up to, 2,000 acres or so. The reach area is actually the footprint of the ditch project we had in place. So the footprint of the site that we widened out. And I think the take home message that I want you to get is the project that was in the conservation ditch design was only a very small percentage of its watershed. I don't know if some folks that hear some of the wetland stuff say, hey, we've got to take 5% of the watershed out of, whatever it is, make it all into wetlands. Well, these are much less than that because a lot of people don't want to see land taken out of production. So they're not huge footprints. Slopes anywhere from very low sloping, almost very flat, tabletop flat, up to 1% or more. So we put them on all different types of stream systems, from bigger drainage areas to smaller drainage areas, high sloping, low sloping. And I mean, the length of this data set's really impressive to me. Rarely do you get data sets of this length unless you're working for someone, somewhere like Old Woman Creek, it has longer data sets. So this graph shows how much material we're accumulating within our conservation ditch reach on an annual basis. So first column, the number of kilograms per year. So multiply that by 2.2. We're looking at 23, 53, 15, 19 tons per reach per year. So it's not a small amount of sediment, nutrients that are accumulating on site. They're actually trapping quite a lot for their small size. When we go out and we look at the bulk, we take soil samples and look at the bulk density. They're not quite, the bulk density is a little bit higher than, say, a lot of wetland soils, but not as much as like upland soils. So they're somewhere kind of in between there. And if you look at the number of kilograms per meter squared per year of material that we're accumulating within the ditch, it's anywhere from 5 to 40 kilograms per meter squared per year. That's a lot. I think if you look at most of the wetland research, you'd find those numbers would be a lot smaller. And it's usually because the drainage areas to those areas are much smaller. So they accumulate at a slightly slower rate. We're looking at watersheds that are hundreds, if not, 1,000 acres or more, contributing to those sites. So they have a really large drainage area relative to their size. And that's probably why we get these really high accumulation rates. So we know how much is from our surveys. We know the volume that's accumulating on size. We go out and we take soil samples. We know the bulk density, and then we send them into the lab, and we can figure out things like how much organic matter is in these soils. So on the 9 sites, 8 or 9 sites that I showed you originally associated with development projects, we're getting anywhere from about 4 or 5% up to 10% or more organic matter in those samples. It's quite a lot. If you look at our 2 Old Woman Creek sites in an agricultural setting, we're up more around this 10% at those 2 sites. So it seems to be accumulating a lot of organic matter. If you look at the amount of phosphorus that's accumulating, we're looking anywhere. Now this is total phosphorus. So they strip it with it, they digest it with an acid, and then they strip off all the phosphorus. This isn't the same number as you would get in like a soil sample sent in for a Malic 3. That's what's available to the plant. This is all the phosphorus. So you can see in our 8 to 9 development sites, they're like 600 to maybe 1,200 parts per million phosphorus. Actually, the one that's really up there high at 1,200 was the one that was downstream of the steel mill that had a lot of iron in it. So maybe that's why that one's a little bit higher. But if we come over and look at our 2 agricultural sites in the Old Woman Creek, we're up here more like 1,000, 1,200 parts per million. And that's because we have more fertilization going on, those sorts of things. Maybe there's something, we find that there's a lot of iron in some of the soils up here. So we're trying to sort those issues out. Why are we getting such high levels in the Old Woman Creek ones? But that's good, because if we're trapping, if there's high levels in there and we're trapping a lot, that means we're keeping a lot on site. Look at the carbon in our development sites. There's 4, 5, 6% or more carbon that's sequestered in there. And we've monitored these over a couple of years. Old Woman Creek seems to be a little bit lower in terms of the carbon percentage, which I find interesting. I know when we just recently did some deep core samples and we got down to the original surface of the ditch, and we could actually tell some leaf matter that had come in there and gotten buried was still in very good condition. So maybe it's not breaking down as much, but lots of carbon in there as well. And then we're getting quite a lot of nitrogen as well, 3,000, 4,000 parts per million, 0.3%. But when you come to the Old Woman Creek, those percentages seem to be higher. So in this agricultural watershed, they seem to be, the concentrations of the nutrients we're finding are higher in those agricultural soils that are buried in the bottom of those two ditches. So you take all that together, the volume, you take the soil samples in and you get the concentration, and we're able to start to say, well, how many grams per, meter squared, when a meter squared is like 10 or 11 square feet, are we trapping each year? And it looks like if you look across all our sites, we're getting about 963 grams of carbon per meter squared per year, about 50 grams of nitrogen per year accumulating on site. And then the one I'm excited about for Lake Erie especially is looks like we're getting about 11.9 grams on average. Now it varies anywhere from a low of 3.2 up to almost 25. So it really depends a lot upon the site characteristics, land use, those sorts of things. And we want to tease that apart one day, but this is exciting that we're getting a lot of big numbers here. And I say these are big for one simple reason. I wanted to see how our values compared to other values published in the literature. So other people are out there monitoring wetlands and swamps and stream restoration projects, and they're coming up with these same sort of numbers. How much sediment was trapped on site, and then how much nutrients were associated with it. So if you go through, our organic matter is as higher than forested wetlands, constructed wetlands. You look at some of the nitrogen, we're accumulating, very similar to a very 10 times, 20 times as much as they have in some of these other riverine wetlands. And I'll go back to the fact that we have a large watershed draining to a small conservation ditch reach that there's a lot of opportunity to trap or material in those sites. Probably the one I'm most excited about, man, maybe you can't see fully because let me see if I can move this. Is the phosphorus. If you look at Bill Mitch is a famous wetland scientist, done a lot of work all over the world. He looked at riverine wetlands and treatment wetlands across the Midwest, and they're looking anywhere from 0.4 grams to 3.5 grams per meter squared per year of phosphorus. That seems to be the floor for the projects we were looking at, 3.2 up to 24.9. And actually our sites in the Old Woman Creek seem to be doing even better than those. So in terms of phosphorus, they might be able to be workhorses in terms of trapping phosphorus. So a lot accumulating on site, but that led to one other question. And, we started presenting some of this and people are like, well, but what's happening? Is it staying there? Is it being released? So that's kind of the next question we wanted to look at. And so we looked at nitrogen and phosphorus mineralization. So what's in that organic matter fraction, what's in the soil can be mineralized into a soluble form that can then be released back to the overlying water column. So we're asking the question, is it a good idea to trap all of this stuff down here with water where it could be processed and released and sent down to the lake where it could cause, it's a soluble phosphorus that's can be causing the problem. So we did all these mineralization tests. We worked with a scientist, Dr. Gregory Noe from the USGS. He had came up with a method to monitor this. It's called the In Situ Resin Core method. And basically we go out, we want to incubate a soil sample in the field. Here's an example of them. We did some work up in Hardin County at one of the Blanchard Demo watersheds, the Kirk watershed site, where they had built a two-stage ditch. And we put these devices, which I'm going to show you here in a minute, these in situ resin cores in the deposited material, so where the two-stage ditch formed. And then when we excavated, when we excavated out the two-stage, that subsoil, it's kind of down here. You can see the color change from the clay subsoil to the dark, rich deposited material. here. So the way we would do this, we would go out, we have a 3-inch thin wall PVC, we put a bevel on it, we take a 7.5-inch soil sample and a 10-inch core, or a 10-centimeter core, and then we take off the bottom 2.5 centimeters. And then what we do is we've got these, they're called resin beads, which will, as phosphorus, as nitrate, ammonia goes by them, these beads will capture that. So these bags of beads are simply O-rings, big Buena N O-rings, and it's undyed nylons. I'll tell you, I got some funny looks when I ordered 400 pairs of undyed nylons, and I submitted that to my fiscal office. They're like, "Why are you buying 400 pairs of nylons?" But then we put the beads in there, and what we do is we put a stack of 3 beads on top and on the bottom. The dark rings here, the dark black rings, those are getting any phosphorus or nitrogen that's mineralized and could be re-released back into the environment. So that 5-centimeter core, if it's releasing soluble phosphorus, nitrogen, those inner bags, those black bags are going to capture it. The kind of the gray shaded bag on top is pulling all the nitrogen, phosphorus, and other ions that are coming from the overlying water column. It'll capture those. Same with the bottom one, that's capturing anything from the groundwater that might be going into our 5-centimeter core. And then the white bags are what are called the check bags. So hopefully we're getting a very small amount in those center white bags, because it lets us know we weren't getting cross contamination between those two. So really what we're interested in is the amount of mineralization that were happening in the black bags and could be potentially released. After a month of incubating these out in the field, real world conditions, we pull those out, we grab the samples, they send them into the lab, extract all the nitrogen, phosphorus, whatever else is on them, and then they report back to us. You can kind of see, here's an example here, these bar charts represent all the different bags. So the green one is the upper bag. Right? So what was coming in from the overlying water column, and you can see it doesn't matter whether it was phosphorus, nitrogen, or ammonia, or nitrate or ammonia. We had much higher levels in the overlying water column than we were releasing. The blue ones on top, those are our check bags. So we hope that blue is a real thin bar. The kind of the orangish tan, that's what was being released from our soil core. Same with the gray one there, that was what was being released from the bottom of the soil core. And then the blue is what was coming from the groundwater. So basically, when I add up the blue and I add up the orange down, the orange at the bottom, if those numbers are pretty small, I'm sure that was a good test. So that was kind of our method with this in situ resin core technique. And then, so we've been applying this not only at the Blanchard Demo watershed, the Kurt Ditch Farm, but we've applied this for 1 year at 2, an upstream and a downstream site in the Old Woman Creek, where there was a 2-stage at the upstream and then a overwide or self-forming channel at the downstream. Here's what the upstream looks like. You can kind of see there's a bit of a channel over here. It kind of goes back and forth between being a 2-stage and more of a wetlandy type environment. And then this is what the downstream site looks like. Definitely more wetland in character. I think we could force it into a 2-stage geometry if we wanted with a nice piece of machinery, but right for now it's a wetland and it's capturing a lot of sediment on site. So after we did these monthly for an entire year, there were times we broke through ice to grab our samples. I have a great field guy I work with, Dan Mecklenburg, that he just goes out and does these. And if you recall, we were talking about how much phosphorus was being trapped on site, and it was anywhere from 3 to 25 grams per meter squared. What we're finding is that very small amounts, if you look at our Old Woman Creek or our Kirk Ditch sites, anywhere less than, a gram or less is being released as soluble phosphorus. And the Old Woman Creek sites, I'll show you in a minute. I don't know if I showed you, they're actually higher than 25 grams per meter squared per year. And even if you have 1 gram out of 25 being released, that's a small percent. You're trapping a lot and releasing a small amount. And in fact, we went to the literature and we tried to find out, well, other people that have used this method, what are they reporting? So if you look at things like, natural stream systems, or restored urban streams, streams and swamps, natural and constructed wetlands, the numbers that we were getting are very consistent with those. So our conservation ditches seem to be no worse than, swamps and wetlands and streams. So if you're gonna say our ditch is bad, it's releasing too much phosphorus, you have to say the same thing about the wetlands and the swamps and all of those other things. So all of those nitrate, ammonia, we're in that same sort of ballpark. So trapping a lot, releasing a small, a fairly small amount, I think is the takeaway message. One of the areas of research that I've been working on lately is, if we're gonna build these ditches, we're gonna generate a lot of sediment or a lot of spoil material. Oftentimes farmers, they might allow that to be put on their field. Other times, if it's not great soil, they want it to be trucked off site, and it can cost a lot of money, to do that trucking, to get rid of that soil. So I was like, well, I've heard of farmers saying, hey, when I dip my ditch, if I put that sediment on, out on the field, I grow pretty good crops in that area. But, we wanted to start to look at that a little bit more closely. So I had a student, Matt Simmons, he just finished up and graduated, looking at, well, can we use these sediments or the subsoils when we excavate a two-stage ditch as soil amendments, and how does it impact agronomic production, corn and soybeans? So this is what we did here. I guess we started off this experiment really, really simply, probably 5 years ago, and we just took sediment from a ditch, and we took sediment from the adjacent field, and we came in the greenhouse in the winter, and we put it in pots, and we planted corn seed. And on the right, you have the corn that grew for 5 or 6 weeks in ditch sediment versus the corn that grew in the field sediment in those same pots. We had better germination rates in the corn on the right. So we're like, okay, maybe there's something to it. The farmer, their observations, let's take this the next step further. But before I went too hog wild on it, I was like, I know farmers are going to ask me about weeds. So what, if you're going to bring all these sediments back, what are you going to do? Are you going to redistribute the weed seed bank? So we did a greenhouse experiment. We went out to 9 ditches. They were clustered in groups of 3, some around Worcester, some up around Hardin, Hancock County, and then some out by the Farm Science Review. So we grabbed sediment from 3 ditches, 9 total, and we packed four bins each, and then we put those in the greenhouse in a mist emitter system to keep them moist so that everything would germinate. We did that for about a month at 50 degrees to kind of let those winter weeds sort of germinate. And then after a month, we kicked it up to 80 degrees to simulate more summer conditions to get those summer annuals to germinate. And at the end, we identified all the weeds, we clipped them, we dried them, we weighed them to figure out, what sort of things will germinate. If we bring that back up to the landscape, what are we going to see? So there was our three clusters of samples, northeast, northwest, and west. We did use what's called a randomized complete block design. We kept them moist, 45 days, a month and a half each. Oops. Try to get off there. And in the end, we identified every weed that we found, how many mesocosms or how many bins we found it in, and then we reported the dry mass of each one. You can see things like giant ragweed was a big issue up in Northwest. We found lots of that relative to the other weeds, but it wasn't so much of a problem in the Northeast and kind of moderate in the West. So we looked at every weed that was there, how much germinated. What we found is that there were 27 to 38 weed species per region. So we found lots of different types of weeds. About 80% of them were broadleafs, 20% grasses. We had more Northeast seemed to grow a lot more weeds than the other regions. So there was more biomass there. About 75 to 90% of the biomass was broadleafs, 10 to 25% grasses. And they're weeds that are just really common to the production environment. Farmers are used to dealing with these sorts of weeds with their crop care programs. And we found that they're really controllable by either pre or post-emergent herbicides. But we've not, I want to caveat, we haven't done any testing on herbicide resistance. So maybe, something about those weeds growing down in those ditches, if there's herbicides getting in there, maybe they're more herbicide tolerant. We can't say much about that now, except for a little bit of experience that we had with a where we actually spread it on a field.
We
yes.
have a question in the chat. Would you like to take it now?
Yeah, go ahead.
So this is Todd from NRCS. Can you discuss the correlation between the percent grade sediment accumulation and TP amounts? I noticed that CLO was 0.06 grade and SCI was 1.1
Yeah.
grade.
So I think slope is a big one. So if you have slower flowing waters, you might get more accumulation. I have done a little bit of a preliminary regression analysis to this. I think the accumulation rates are going to be highest when we have a large watershed area relative to the site size, or so the conservation ditch size. But slope plays in that too, because if it's a lower sloping, it's going to be more placid and you'll have more opportunity for sediment to drop out along with the phosphorus for that. So yeah, I think we need to look at I think if we could predict which watershed characteristics promoted higher deposition rates or accumulation rates, we might be able to target and predict where we want to spend, where we would want to target these practices. So I think that's possible, and maybe we're getting close to enough sites to do that, but you want to measure a lot of different, range of conditions to really understand what factors promote deposition. But slope is one that makes a lot of sense. Your watershed area relative to your site area makes a lot of, I think there's some things like that. So great question. Anything else?
No, I think you covered it.
Good. After we figured out what types of weeds were growing there, we kind of went in and looked at the labels of some of our common agricultural herbicides. We use an Acuron program. So the thing we found is that the things that farmers are typically using, all of these weed species were controllable. So it's not like we were bringing something out of there that would be really problematic, or we didn't have a chemical control option for. And we kind of saw that when we went out and did an experiment. So we kind of scaled up from the greenhouse. We said, okay, let's go put this out on some small plot research. We have a variable rate manure spreader. With some class projects, we'd spread some where we were doing some ditch work. We had spread some sediments before. So we went out and we got some of these sediments that we had dipped out from a ditch. We put them in the manure spreader and we put them on 10-foot wide by 40-foot wide plots. You can see we built some wings for our spreader so it wouldn't spread it wide. And then we were able to measure how much ditch sediment we were able to put on those plots. We had 8 treatments, and we replicated that 5 times. So our treatments were, first of all, the field just by itself. We planted straight into the field. Second treatment was the field plus chemical fertilizers. So we took soil samples of all our plots and we used the tri-state fertilizer recommendations to come up with how much NPK we needed to apply. And then we applied DAP and potash to come up to what the tri-state fertilizer recommendations would suggest prior to plant. We did put on 7 gallons of 28% nitrogen at planting with our planter. And then we side dressed. We missed the opportunity to do that with our equipment. So the corn got a little bit too tall. So we weighed out a bunch of urea and I went out with a cup and spread it by hand in between the rows myself. So we put on the exact amount that we had to. We did a side dress, but this is very typical of what a farmer would do in real life. We tried to replicate what they would do. The other treatments we had sediment, just ditch sediment by itself, ditch sediment plus fertilizer. We did dairy manure solids. Some people might call them squeezings. And then we did that with dairy manure and fertilizer, chemical fertilizer. And then we did subsoil. So when you excavate a 2-stage ditch and you get that soil that's 5 feet, 6 feet down, real tough clay, maybe some gravel, we spread that too, because we wanted to say, hey, well, if we're building one of these projects, is it okay to spread that subsoil, or is that something we want to get rid of? So those were our 8, and we did that with and without fertilizer. We didn't try to balance the nutrients on that. So I didn't try to put as much nutrients on in the dairy manure solids as we did with the sediment, because I would have ended up with 8 inches of dairy manure solids, and no farmer wants to plant corn into 8 inches of dairy manure solids. It wouldn't turn out well. So our application rates were about 18 tons on the dairy manure solids. The subsoil, we targeted maybe a 1/2 inch. So that turned out to be about 115 tons per acre on average. So just a thin dusting. We didn't want to spread 2 inches because nobody wants to plant corn into, dry clay subsoil. And then for our ditch sediment, the rich stuff that was deposited there, we tried to target about two inches, which would have given us about 430 tons per acre average over those. So it's nice we were able to measure that. And interestingly, after we spread it and then we went ahead and planted it, our planter that the students where I work help build has these things called smart firmers. And they're able, it's got some technology in there, some LED lights and sensors that predicts what the organic matter levels are in the furrow. And I don't know if you can see here's our treatment map on the right. And if you look real closely, you can start to see where we spread subsoil, the organic matter levels got lower. And where we spread ditch sediment, our organic matter levels got higher. After we spread it, we did a quick tillage pass, a shallow tillage pass on it, mixed it up a little bit. But I thought it was really interesting to see we had an immediate effect on our organic matter levels that we could tell from the sensors on our planter. About mid-season, several weeks in, we went in and we did some stand counts. So how did our treatments impact stand counts? And I don't know if you can see this real well, but highlighted in blue are 3 areas where we had reductions in stand counts. And that reduction in stand count is actually where we put our sediment treatments on. The ditch sediment with all the organic matter, we actually had some reduced stand counts. And in hindsight, we were thinking about it, we put out a lot of organic matter a couple weeks before planting. We thought there might have been some seed corn maggot that came in. In one instance, most of our populations were 32,000. We had some as low as 22,000. So a recommendation we might make to a farmer is maybe do a seed treatment that will help deal with that seed corn maggot issue. We went in at tassel and we pulled the ear leaves. It tells you a little bit about what's the nutrient sufficiency in the corn plant. So we picked a bunch of ear leaves and then we sent them in, and you can see that wherever we had chemical fertilizers, our leaf nitrogen was higher, our plant nitrogen was higher, as opposed to where we didn't. But interestingly, the sufficiency range is somewhere in between 3.8 and 4.1, and we met those on almost every instance except for the subsoil. Our phosphorus levels were pretty good overall, and potassium was all within range. So there were some differences in plant nutrients based on which treatment they had. We did look at things like the plant height and then the stalk diameter. So how much biomass are we putting on? So T1 is the control field. T2 is the control field plus fertilizer. T3 is just sediment, the rich ditch sediment, and T4 is the rich ditch sediment plus fertilizer. You can see that those treatments with the sediment had significantly taller plants, and then the diameter of those plants, we had a greater diameter, stalk diameter as well. And we think the reason that is because when we went in and we did plant growth staging, we found that the plants that were grown in the sediment actually were 1 to 2 growth stages ahead. So around the V5, V6 growth stages for corn, they really start to grow and put on additional girth. But those treatments had much bigger plants at the end of the season as well. So we did notice that the plants emerged quicker, they were a growth stage ahead, and they put on more biomass as well. Kind of some of the takeaway messages. Like I said, we had lower stand counts where we had sediment amended plots. We were 1 growth stage ahead. The stalk diameters were significantly bigger in the sediment amended plots. Plant tissue analysis was all pretty good. We found this field with our typical crop protection program was clean all year. We did not have any weed problems from bringing that sediment back into the field. We observed very little disease pressure. We did notice that there was some Japanese beetle emergence, mostly in the sediment plots, and we think that's because the grubs for the Japanese beetles kind of overwinter in grassy areas. So maybe that was a safe haven for them, and when we put that back on, we brought those insects back into the field, which we didn't do anything. It wasn't at a level that was economically justifiable to do anything with, so we just kind of let them go. But we did notice that that was an issue. So we're trying to get plant pathologists, entomologists, and things involved in this research going forward, because that's a little bit outside of my expertise area. What I was really interested in is, well, what did this do to yields here? So of our 5 replicates, we took the means and medians and we plotted box and whisker plots. And essentially you can see that our treatment 4, which was the sediment plus fertilizer, was the highest. And any other box that has the letter A means it was not significantly different from that group. So you can see the sediment plus fertilizer was not different from the sediment, and it was not different from the subsoil plus fertilizer, which I found really interesting. So those 3 were not significantly different. Whereas if you get into the chemical the chemical fertilizer plots, those were not significantly different from sediment alone, but it was different from sediment and fertilizer. So there was no difference. If we just use sediment versus chemical fertilizer, there was no significant difference between those 2. There was the cost of spreading the sediment, but we also avoided the cost of fertilizers on those. And the last time I checked on the corn enterprise budget, that was about a $300 per acre per year cost. We have not quantified how much it's going to cost to spread these sediments on a large scale basis. We need to do that yet. We have a HABRI grant to try and do some of that work. Interesting. So let's look at some of the mean yields. The control field, just the field by itself, was about 188 bushels an acre. Add the control plus fertilizer, and we're up to 214 bushels per acre. It makes sense. You have more fertilizer, more corn. The sediment was higher than that, about 8 bushels higher. So just sediment alone, we got an extra 8 bushels of corn on average. But if we added the sediment plus fertilizer, we're up to 242. I'm not going to dwell on the manure much, but I do want to get to the subsoil. It does look where we just spread that nasty subsoil from a 2-stage ditch construction, the clay material. We did have a yield drag. It was about 8 bushels less on average than just our field. What I found really interesting, and I'd like to investigate a little bit more, is where we had subsoil plus fertilizer, it went up to 230. In fact, it was the second highest. Could be a couple explanations for that. When you're dipping this stuff out, it's hard to totally separate the subsoil from the deposited sediment. So who knows, maybe some of the nutrients leaked into that. We did analyze the subsoil for their chemical contents, and they were lower. So I don't really understand that. Maybe if it was a clay material on a sandy soil, I could see it increasing the cation exchange capacity. I want to investigate that a little bit more because I found that surprising. So you can see year 1, basically, if you're comparing chemical fertilizers to sediment, it looks like we've got about 8 bushels more corn on average. Save the fertilizer cost. The second year, we're like, oh, let's do this again. Let's see if there's a multiple year effect on this. So the second year, we didn't do anything. I just no-tilled beans straight into it. And interestingly, the 2 highest yielding treatments were our sediment amended plots. So you can see where we had sediment and fertilizer the previous year, we averaged about 78 bushels, 77 on just sediment alone. Whereas our chemical fertilizer treatment 2, we were down below 70. So it looks like we maybe had an 8 bushel soybean advantage in year 2 without doing anything additional. So once again, our subsoil plus fertilizer the previous year, that is up there. That's still a little bit curious to me, but everything else seems to make sense in this particular, experiment to graph the results. So does look like there can be some benefits in terms of crop production, where if you're trying to convince a landowner to do this, that to help keep the cost down, this may be a reason because they can produce more crops as a result. If you want to take the example of one of our old Woman Creek sites up here, one site is about a 900-foot reach. When this was done roughly 10 years ago, it cost about a little over $13,000 or $14 a linear foot to do. Obviously, we've had some inflation and costs might be a little bit higher nowadays, but we estimated based on some survey data that there's about 1,250 cubic yards of sediment stored in that reach. If you assume a bulk density of 0.5 gram per centimeter cubed, which I think that's actually on the low end. We actually took deep core samples and we know it does get more dense towards the bottom, but we also haven't analyzed the phosphorus and nitrogen that's down there. So we're doing that right now. But if we just make these assumptions, it looks like we've stored about nearly 1,200 pounds of P in that 900-foot reach. If you scale that up to a mile, that's about 743 pounds per mile per year. So you can start to address some pretty significant problems, with just, some short reaches of this. I would actually put most of these, if we had small ditches that were direct tributaries to large rivers, because once the water gets in, sediment gets into a large river, chances are most of it's going down to Lake Erie. I would actually target it in those sort of places. But if we use all these numbers, we actually see we're getting about 27.5 grams of P per meter squared per year, which is higher than any of the numbers I showed you earlier. If you actually take the amount of NP and K per cubic yard of sediment that we dipped out, it looks like there was about $8 worth of nutrients that the farmer might be able to use. And then it wasn't just a drop in the bucket. If you take those 1,250 yards and you spread that 1 inch thick, it should cover about 9 acres. So we're not talking about, a few hundred square feet. We're talking you can cover substantial areas for this. And after you have your overwide ditch built, you might be able to mine this thing every so many years to restart that process. So that seemed kind of encouraging. Like I said, we've only, in an agricultural setting, measured this at a couple of places, so I wouldn't, make blanket statements about anything. We need to study this more broadly. But one of the things that's coming up, if you haven't already heard, the H2 Ohio program just put together a pot of about $5 million. It was thrown out real quickly, and we had there was some interest in it. They were able to dedicate most of the money to projects, but this is something they could do in future years to expand the adoption of this if landowners are open to it. It goes through soil and water districts or county engineers' offices, who's ever dealing with some of the the drainage issues in a particular county. Does anybody have any questions? I wanted to leave a little time for questions if there are any.
So I just want to say that Eric Sass from ODNR actually just kind of did a PSA, which goes along with that last slide that you just did, that the H2 Ohio program actually does help support the natural channel infrastructure with some funding that's available. So
Great.
I know there's a lot of districts right now that are also on this presentation. Some of those districts may actually be ones that already submitted in the first round to get some of these projects put in. So it's just exciting to see there's some funding for the project, and then, not only can we see the water quality improvements from this, but there may actually be this sustainable nature of these projects for the agricultural community as well. If anybody has any questions, you guys could either go off mute or you could put them in the chat. We do have one one question in the chat from Bradley at APIS. Any associated data on invertebrate and vertebrate populations over time in the ditch projects?
So I'm trying to think back. Ohio EPA, after doing some of those over wide channel projects, they did go out and visit those annually, I think, for 4 or 5 years. Heather, I can't remember her name. They would have that data down there. We didn't collect that. They collected that. There has been a couple other research projects. I think maybe Kevin McClooney up at Bowling Green has done some work in that area. But I haven't done a lot of that type of work for a long time. But there are some data sets out there. Heidelberg may have looked at some things as well, but I'm pretty sure Kevin McClooney has.
In the Old Woman Creek's overwide ditch, we
Yeah.
actually do sample macroinvertebrates annually.
Yes.
The only downside is we're not using the same ICI protocol that EPA uses. And we also don't have any pre-project information. We only have post-project. So if anyone's interested in that, they can reach out to me and I can give them those data sets.
Minnesota has done a bit of work with that, as well as fish communities where they have naturally formed 2-stage ditches. So a county engineer, somebody built it over wide accidentally. It wasn't a design choice. They just built it over wide, and they've done some paired watershed studies on that and found some pretty impressive results where you get those habitat features, forming, that sort of thing, so. Great. Anybody else?
Nobody else in the chat right now. I'll give everybody one last chance if you want to. Oh, we do have one. It says, will this video be posted anywhere? And Jen, you can answer this one.
Yeah, I'm gonna try to, put the recording on, Oldham Creek has a playlist that is on the Ohio Department of Natural Resources YouTube channel. We have our own playlist, so if you go to that playlist, hopefully give us a week or so to zhuzh it up a bit, do the editing and then we'll put it there.
Great. I also want to put out, I know there were maybe 12, at least 12 applications for the two-stage cell forming through the H2 Ohio. So if there's any of the local folks that are working with those projects, we're sorting through them now. And part of one of our grants is we need to do some monitoring of those because, the state is investing a lot of money. So we want to figure out what kind of benefits they're having and try to understand whether or not that continued investment is worthwhile, or if there's better ways to spend taxpayer money. So at some of the existing sites that are going to be put in, we may be reaching out to you here in the upcoming months or so, trying to get some monitoring infrastructure. So if one of those projects are, one of yours, we greatly appreciate any help you can do. Because I'm a taxpayer too. I want to know whether or not this is a good use of taxpayer money. So we're going to do that research to try and establish that with this new set of projects that are going out.
I just put my email in the chat. If we do have emails for anyone who registered, I know we sent this link out so people can just kind of log on and join us. If you weren't already pre-registered and you're interested in getting a link when the video goes up on YouTube, just email me and we'll make sure that we can get you that. And with that, we're just a little bit over an hour. So if there's no other questions, I guess we'll just wrap this up. I just want to thank Jon again for coming up here. I guess, again, just the thing that gets me really excited about this is that we know that that wetlands can always provide a lot of nutrient and sediment filtration for us, water quality wise. But as a lot of probably the conservation district people who are on this, we know that sometimes it's a very, very hard sell for some of our landowners. So just being able to see some of this research that shows working within a drainage course may be a much more palatable conservation strategy for some of our agricultural areas.
Combine those together, the water quality and the drainage benefit, hopefully that might be palatable to some people that might not otherwise. So thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, and thanks everyone for logging on today, and for those who came in person, I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.